We are continuing our series on the Gospel of Mark today. We're going to look at Mark 2:23 through 3:6. If you have your Bible and want to go ahead and turn there, you can do that. We saw last week how Jesus started to come in conflict with the religious leaders of the time. He came into conflict with the Sanhedrin. He came into conflict with the Pharisees. And we will see that this theme continues into the passage that we look at today. Last week, we noted that the Sanhedrin was basically the Jewish Supreme Court. They had the key function of serving as the guardians of orthodoxy. And this week, the emphasis is more focused on the Pharisees, who were basically self-appointed watchdogs of orthodoxy. They were extremely influential on public opinion. And if they took an interest in someone because they suspected them of being some threat to their power or being a threat to orthodoxy, they would set about keeping close watch on that person. N.T. Wright says they served a role similar to media members that track public figures looking for any misstep to report. This is kind of the self-appointed role that the Pharisees took upon themselves. And even though here in the text we'll consider today, we're still in the early stages of Jesus' public ministry, the Pharisees have already taken note of Jesus, and they are already keeping tabs on Jesus. They're following him around to make sure, or to try, I should say, to catch him in anything that will enable them to bring charges against him or to turn public opinion against him. They very much, in the terminology that we're familiar with today, they very much wanted to cancel Jesus. Although, as we'll see at the end of our text, they took that to an extreme place. So we're going to read in our text today two confrontations that Jesus had with the Pharisees over the proper observance of the Sabbath. And in these interactions with the Pharisees, Jesus confronts legalism. So we'll see how Jesus responds. We'll see what he teaches about the Sabbath, what he says about legalism, and in seeing what happened then, we're going to learn some important lessons for today. So let's look at Mark 2:23 through 3:6. It should be on the screen. I'll read and you can follow along as I do. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" He answered, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. And then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Another time, Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." Then Jesus asked them, "Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill?" But they remained silent. He looked around them. Note this, he looked around them in anger, and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. That was where they were canceling Jesus. They wanted to kill Jesus. They wanted to cancel him in the ultimate way. And so we see in the text that Jesus had two confrontations with the Pharisees regarding the Sabbath. The first one is there in chapter 2, verses 23 through 28, and it was about Jesus' disciples picking grain to eat on the Sabbath. What they did was not a violation of the true intent of the Sabbath, but it was a violation of the rules and regulations that had been erected around the Sabbath by the religious leaders. Among the thousands of rules that the Pharisees were zealous for were ones that dictated things like you can't reap on the Sabbath, you can't thresh on the Sabbath, you can't winnow or prepare a meal on the Sabbath day. And so Jesus' disciples were simply picking heads of grain and eating them, but for the Pharisees, this was a violation of the rules. And it was considered to be work which was not supposed to be done on the Sabbath. The point here is that the Pharisees, the religious leaders, had taken a broad encouragement against working on the Sabbath that was a part of the original intent of the Sabbath, and they had legislated it to the point where they had categorized things, they had labeled things to be work that really were not work at all. And so according to the rules and the regulations that made up the law that they had made and erected around the original commandment of the Sabbath, the disciples had in fact broken the letter of the law. And Jesus does not dispute this in the text. By the way, if it would have happened to cross your mind, the law did allow for hungry people to pick grain from someone else's field in order to satisfy immediate hunger. But it did not permit them to use a sickle. And here's what this means. It didn't permit harvesting in another person's field for use beyond satisfying your immediate need. I think that's pretty interesting. You were welcome to help yourself to what you could pick, but you could not harvest and provide for yourself beyond satisfying the immediate need. So the Pharisees are following Jesus around, hoping to catch him and his followers in some wrongdoing. And so now they think they've caught him, and, by the letter of the law, they have caught them. And so they say to Jesus, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? And Jesus answers them by reminding them of the time that David was fleeing from Saul. And he and his men had entered the house of God, and they had eaten the consecrated bread that by law only the priests were allowed to eat. David ate it, and he gave it to his companions, and they ate it. And this happened in the period of time after David had been anointed king of Israel, but before he had actually ascended, been recognized by the public, and actually claimed the throne. You have to understand that David was revered by the Pharisees. And so Jesus uses the example of one of their heroes to show that the rules of the law are not always absolute. That there are situations that call for, that allow for the rules to be relaxed. And with the example of David, Jesus is claiming to the Pharisees, and this is important, this is a theme we see throughout today's text, Jesus is claiming to the Pharisees that human need takes precedence over the rules and regulations of the law that they have added on top of God's commandments. He's saying that human need takes priority over ritualistic piety. And again, this is a theme that we see throughout this text and really throughout the entire ministry of Jesus. And so I want you to note this. This is really the most important thing, I would say, that we're talking about today. The most important point I want you to get. Human need is a higher priority than ritualistic law observance. It is a higher priority than ritualistic piety. Something else that probably was going on here with Jesus invoking David to answer the Pharisees' charge against him and his disciples is this. David ate the consecrated bread, as I mentioned, after having been anointed king by Samuel, but before he was formally recognized as king and took the throne. Jesus, you may remember, was often referred to as the son of David. David was a type of Christ. Jesus is the greater David. And so theologian N.T. Wright says that by referring to David, Jesus was, quote, subtly indicating that he is the true king marked out by God, but not yet recognized and enthroned. Would the Pharisees have caught that? Whether they grasped the full meaning of it or not, I don't know. But I think it's likely that they did not miss that Jesus had just compared what he and his disciples had done to David and his men. And I think that comparison would have caught their attention. But again, the main point of this confrontation, the outcome of this confrontation, is that human need takes priority and preference over ritualistic piety. The second confrontation between Jesus and the Pharisees regarding the Sabbath was about Jesus healing on the Sabbath. One day, Jesus and his disciples were in the synagogue, and there was a man there with a withered hand. And again, the Pharisees were there keeping watch over Jesus, watching to see if he would heal the man on the Sabbath, because they considered this to be inappropriate work. Now, some people believe that the Pharisees very likely intentionally placed this man in the synagogue to set a trap for Jesus. They were confident that if he came across this man, he would heal him. And then they would have a charge against him for healing on the Sabbath. And so some believe this man was intentionally placed there by the Pharisees. Here are some interesting things about the law at that time. The law allowed for medical intervention to save a person's life. But get this, the law only permitted the least possible effort that could save the person's life. So you could save a life, but you could just barely save it. Like you weren't really allowed to heal it, you could just stop them from dying, is basically what you were permitted to do. Nothing beyond the least effort possible was permitted. William Barclay tells us that injuries could be kept from getting worse, but no effort to actually make the injury better was permitted. And as example, Barclay explains that a fracture couldn't be treated because it was not life-threatening. A cut could be bandaged to stop the bleeding, but ointment couldn't be applied. Jesus knew the motivation of the Pharisees. And so, likely knowing that this man was placed here as a trap, Jesus gladly accepts the terms of engagement. And he says to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." And in front of everyone, Jesus exposes the Pharisees. He asks them this question: which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save a life or to kill? And so they're caught. Their rules say you can't work on the Sabbath and that healing is working. But the law does allow for doing good on the Sabbath. The law does allow for saving a life on the Sabbath. Healing this man was a moral good. Healing this man was a life-saving thing. Maybe not in the sense of whether he lived or died, but some theologians believe this man was a tradesman who had lost the ability to provide for himself and his family because of the shriveled hand. Healing him would be a life-changing good. In a sense, it would truly be a life-saving action. And so Jesus asked this question, and the Pharisees don't answer Jesus. The text says they remain silent. Verse 5 tells us that Jesus looked around at them in anger and was deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts. He gave them an opportunity to come to the right conclusion. Of course it's right to do good on the Sabbath. Of course it's right to heal and to save on the Sabbath. But they cared more about their regulations regarding work than they cared about a man being healed and once again being able to provide for the needs of his family. And this angered Jesus. He was distressed by how hard-hearted they were. And so Jesus said to the man, in front of them all, stretch out your hand. The man did, and his hand was completely healed, completely restored. Would that change their mind? Would seeing the joy on the man's face, would seeing him perhaps, we're speculating, but perhaps leaping for joy, like would that change their mind? No, that wouldn't change their mind. The Pharisees had what they wanted out of this situation. They had caught Jesus working on the Sabbath. So verse 6 says that they went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. By the way, the Pharisees did not like the Herodians. But they were so intent on getting Jesus that they plotted with their enemies to try to kill Jesus. And the point of the second confrontation is the same as the first confrontation. Again, Jesus has demonstrated that human need is at the heart of true Sabbath observance. Human need takes priority, takes precedent over ritualistic piety. And here's something we need to acknowledge. Jesus can make that determination. Jesus can do that. And he told them, and he tells us why in chapter 2, verse 28. Here's what Jesus said of himself. The Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Here's what he's saying. Hey, Pharisees, listen up. I can define what is lawful and unlawful on the Sabbath. I'm the arbiter of what is and isn't lawful because, listen close, Pharisees, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. I'm the guy who started the thing. I'm the guy who instituted the thing. So I know what is and isn't permitted. And let me tell you, eating grain isn't work, and it's permitted. And healing isn't work, and it's permitted. And in verse 27, Jesus explains the Sabbath in a way that completely exposes the wrongheadedness of the Pharisees' approach to it. Jesus says, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was meant to be a blessing to people, not a legalistic obligation, not a burden that they had to carry around. Men and women were not meant to serve the Sabbath. The Sabbath was meant as a means of blessing for men and women. I don't think it's going too far to say the Sabbath was meant for the service of people, not people for the service of the Sabbath. David McKenna says it this way: the Sabbath is built on the moral principle of grace rather than the religious regulation of the law. The Sabbath was meant to be a means of grace for people, not burdensome ritual that leads them into bondage, the bondage of legalism, where instead of receiving a good gift from the hand of God, the gift is turned into an obligation that must be observed in order to stay in God's good graces. The Pharisees had turned this good gift from God into a burden. They had also turned it into a litmus test for who was a good Jew. It wasn't enough that they made a legalistic thing out of a good and gracious gift. They had also turned it into a means of constant comparison where they judged their own people harshly and accused each other of not being faithful and good because they didn't keep the laws around the Sabbath as fully as what the Pharisees did. One of their fellow Jews might have even kept the Sabbath. But if they forgot one of the many regulations and by accident violated one of these useless, petty, not what God intended regulations, then the Pharisees would pounce and criticize and divide and accuse them of being a bad Jew. The Pharisees took a good gift that God gave for the purpose of refreshing and blessing and made it a weapon that they could wield against other people. They completely corrupted the meaning and the purpose of the Sabbath. And so we have seen the two confrontations that Jesus had with the Pharisees over the Sabbath. We have seen how he responded to their legalism, confronting it and rebuking it, and setting this principle in place that human need takes priority over ritualistic piety. And now I want us to consider three ways that we can apply what we've seen in this text to our own lives in Pataskala, Ohio in 2023. Here's the first one. We need to constantly remind ourselves of what Jesus over and over again tried to get through to the Pharisees. True religion is not about ritualistic keeping of rules, but about loving service to God and to others. I would ask you to engage with a question. Are there any rules that aren't truly biblical? Like, if you're really honest with yourself, you can't find a biblical reason for it. But there are a rule that you have in your own mind. It's really just your own preference. And you know, if you're honest with yourself, that you allow it to get in the way of loving or serving others, or just how you feel about other people. If they violate this rule, then you will take a negative posture, a negative internal attitude toward them. Let me give you an example of one I've heard at various times over the years, and I want to assure you and assure members of our worship team that I came up with this illustration not knowing that two members of our worship team would have hats on today, okay? So view this as me having their back, not drawing attention to them. But I wasn't giving up my illustration just because they wore hats, all right? So here we go. I've heard this a number of times over the years, not very recently, but I have heard this a number of times since being the pastor of this church. It really upsets me when people wear hats in church. It's just so disrespectful. Kindly, gently, it's really not. It's really not. I would tell you that this is ritualistic piety. You're welcome to your preference, but it's not actually disrespectful in 2023 to wear a hat in church. I haven't pressed you this far, but I've considered wearing a hat in church myself. I've considered doing it to preach to you. But I know people can only take so much, so I haven't. I grew up in a church tradition where, at least on the holidays, about half the women came to church with ginormous hats on their heads. But for the man to wear a hat was a sign of utter disrespect. What's going on there? People are taking an outdated item of cultural etiquette and in their minds making it a matter of religious piety, when it really is no such thing. I didn't anticipate feeling so awkward with this one, but here we are. We cannot let these kind of things cause us to pass judgments against brothers and sisters, even if it only happens in the privacy of our own minds. It creates barriers between us and them, even if we never say anything. We will have passed an unrighteous judgment against someone. Here's the greatest application of this first point. The greatest application of the first application. You can go to church every week. You can show up at every church event. You can read your Bible every day. And if it is not translating into loving service to God and others, to a large extent, you're engaging in ritualistic religion rather than true religion. Here's why. All of those things are meant to form us into people that go and lovingly serve God and others. The Pharisees loved church. The Pharisees loved studying the Bible. The Pharisees loved all the public trappings of religion, participating in those, fully engaging in those. But they could look at a man with a withered hand and feel nothing, and become enraged if he was healed at the wrong time. All of this stuff that we talk about and sing about and read about as Christians, it is supposed to translate into loving action. The second application. We should recover the principle of Sabbath without giving into legalism. I personally believe that in the new covenant, every day is holy to the Lord. Every day belongs to the Lord. Not just one day is to be set aside for that purpose. I also think it's a good argument can be made that Jesus himself is our Sabbath rest. But the principle of Sabbath, of having a rhythm to life that includes days of rest and relaxation and uninterrupted time with family and uninterrupted time with the Lord, these are all good things. We should never be legalistic about it with each other or even with ourselves, because the Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath. But many of us here today are not well rested. We would do well to schedule into our lives days that we commit to rest and refreshment. It would do us so much good if we would do that. And so I encourage you, without becoming legalistic about it, consider how can you recover the principle of Sabbath in your life, that you schedule into your life intentional times, days, seasons, even hours of intentional rest, relaxation, refreshment, times of enjoyment. And then here's the third application. We have to root out legalism wherever we find it, because it makes a burden out of things that are meant to be a joy. And I just want to share a story with you of a way that we did this here at Living Hope Church. So, for probably the first 16 years that we were a church, one of our 7 commitments of membership was that you had to be a part of a small group. You probably don't remember that. Many of you because you're newer. Some of you because you seem to have forgotten that when it was a requirement. But that was a requirement that you committed. It was required that you commit to a small group as a member of Living Hope Church. And over the years, people really weren't doing it. I think at our very best, we had like 45% of the church that was in a small group, maybe 50. But most of the time, it was probably more down around 30 to 35% of the time. And I want to at least share what it did to me that you wouldn't do that. It tempted me to become a Pharisee. I wasn't happy about it, frustrated about it. Why won't people do this? What's wrong with everybody? And we'd in elder meetings, like, how can we get people going to groups? Do we need to remind them of the commitment? Like, do we need to get people up there that are really energetic and tell them how great a group is? Like, what do we need to do to get people to go to groups? And we would hear from people from time to time, hey, I'm sorry, life is just a little bit too busy, and we don't have groups on the nights that I could go. And I always heard those, and I wasn't dismissive of them, but I did retain in my mind this thought that, if they really chose to prioritize it, they would go to the group. And then one day I sat down with a couple in the church, a couple that wanted to go to a group, but felt that they couldn't. And when they were done explaining their life to me, I said in my mind, these people really cannot go to a group. They could not prioritize this if they chose to. Their life is such, they can't go to a group. Now, do I wish their life had been different? Yes. But it was what it was. And they simply could not go to a group. And for me, this put me on a course that eventually I talked with our elders about, and we made a change to the commitments of membership. And here's how we changed it. We took being a part of a small group out of the commitments of membership. And instead, we put in its place this commitment to simply be involved in the life of the church. And so we list now a variety of things that people can do in the church. You know, take a discipleship class, come to fellowship events, include your kids in the ministries that we have in the church. And so instead of looking at a member and saying, are they in a group or not, and like putting everything on that, we look at our congregation now and we say, are they involved in the life of the church? It was a direct response to a realization that human need needs to take priority over ritualistic piety. I won't blame this on the elders, but I was internally, I don't think I beat anyone up too bad about it in person, but internally, I was becoming very legalistic about this. Very unhappy that people wouldn't do this. And God finally got through to me and said, is it about making people do, like, didn't you want a small group to be a blessing to people, Brian? Yes. Okay. Well, why would you take this thing you wanted to be a blessing and make it something you're sort of hanging over everybody's head and frustrated about? And so we just undid it. And we went with a much more libertine commitment of membership. And so this is an example of how we have walked this out in our own church. We want to recognize that, and in this case I would use the Sabbath as just any sort of religious observance that is good. It needs to be in the service of people, not something that we ask people to serve. Because the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, says Jesus, the Lord of the Sabbath. And so may we be people who place a higher priority on human need than ritualistic piety. And to the extent we do this, we model our lives on Jesus and we please Jesus. Let's stand.